He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by Him all things were created. Now what things, Paul? Well, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by Him and for Him. He is before all things, and in Him all things hold together. And He is the head of the body, the church. He's the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything He might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all His fullness dwell in Him, and through Him to reconcile all things to Himself, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through His blood shed on the cross. By Him and for Him were all things created. We hear the heavenly host in Revelation crying out praises to Him because He is the one who created all things. By Him and for Him all things were created. He created the world. Jesus was born of a virgin. A second thing that this passage in Isaiah tells us is that He was fully human. This is a vital understanding for us. This is what has caused a lot of debate through the centuries. Was Jesus human or was He divine? And one of the earliest controversies was brought about by the Gnostics, and they said, well, He was divine, but He wasn't really human. He looked human, but He just had an appearance of being human, and He didn't leave any footprints when He walked, and He was divine and just had an appearance of being human. But folks, we need to understand that it's important for us to comprehend that He was fully human. Listen to the hymn that Paul cites in Philippians chapter 2. You're familiar with it. Philippians 2, beginning with verse 5. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, there we have the divine, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped or clung to, but made Himself nothing, literally emptied Himself, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, He humbled Himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. It is vital that we understand that Jesus was fully human, and in a moment I will point out to you why that point is so vital. But in this passage, she'll give birth to a son, and His name will be called Emmanuel. So He was fully human. 1 John chapter 4, the first two verses. This same apostle, this same disciple that wrote the Gospel of John, we believe, wrote the first epistle of John. And so this would have been one of Jesus' closest friends that wrote this. And he said, "Dear friends, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world." Okay, so how do we know? This is how you can recognize the Spirit of God, he says. Every spirit that acknowledges that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. Now, that was one of the litmus tests that John gave for being able to tell whether the spirit of the prophet, the proclaimer, the preacher, was true or not. If he does not proclaim that Jesus Christ came in the flesh, he says he's a false prophet. In fact, he says in that first epistle also that is the Antichrist. Now, we're looking for one person, and our minds have been made to think in that way, but he said already the Antichrists are among you. And who are they? Well, those that do not believe that Jesus came in the flesh. Why is that so important? Because by Him coming in the flesh, by the way, Christianity is the only religion, if you want to refer to it that way, where God came to us. Every other religion, we have to get to God. But because He came in the flesh, God Himself came and became like we are. Took on these bodies, experienced the temptations, the pain, the suffering. He experienced rejection. He experienced all of those things, even anger. 2 times He got angry. Once with the money changers in the temple, the second time when the disciples wouldn't let the children to Him, which is why it's so important to me to have the children with us. I think all these groups that shuttle the children off somewhere else are kind of like those disciples were. So I think we ought to have them with us. But he experienced anger. He experienced all the emotions, all the temptations that we experience. And because of that, He completely understands us. There is not anything that comes your way that He has not already experienced. There is no temptation that you will go through that He didn't experience Himself. That's why it's so vital that we believe that Jesus came in the flesh. Now, I know a preacher who says, well, Jesus was tempted, but He really wasn't able to sin. He calls that the doctrine of the impeccability of Christ. Folks, I don't buy that. I think that He could have sinned. Because if He didn't experience the full impact of the temptations, He really wouldn't understand what we go through. Listen to what the writer of Hebrews says. Hebrews chapter 4, verses 15 and 16. We do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize. He sympathizes with our weakness. But we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet was without sin. What's the result of that? Because we have a high priest who knows exactly what we experience. There is no sin in your life that surprises Him. There is no sin that you have committed that separates you from Him. Why? Because He knows everything. Because He experienced it Himself. And so the writer of Hebrews goes on to say, because we have that kind of high priest who sympathizes with us in our weaknesses. Let me parenthetically say that, unfortunately, a lot of what we hear from pulpits today is that you've got to overcome your weaknesses. Well, I have found that it's better to let Christ in me overcome those weaknesses. His work is finished. It's accomplished. Now He's working in us to accomplish His will. That's what Paul says in Philippians 2:13. It is God who works in you both to will and to do according to His good pleasure. And I'm grateful that God is the one who's working in me. Or Philippians 1:6, being confident of this, He who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. So, because He understands, because He sympathizes with our weaknesses, what is the result? Well, because of that, because we have that kind of high priest, the writer of Hebrews says, let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence. Not in fear and trembling. Not afraid that a lightning bolt's going to come from the throne and destroy us. But we can approach the throne of grace with confidence. Why? Because our great high priest has already passed through the heavenly tabernacle and has sat down at the right hand of the Majesty where He ever lives to make intercession for us. Because His work is complete, and it's complete in us. We are complete. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need.